Good to see you again, Tim.
As always, Brad, I appreciate the time we have together. And whoa, we got a whole lot to talk about today, don't we?
We do. Why don't we start with the headlines out of Europe for some big American tech companies? Both Google and Meta have gotten their hands slapped recently. And the area we could start with certainly is GDPR. Europe demonstrated that that has some teeth and fined Meta about $1.3 billion for data that they were transferring from the EU to the US. What are your initial thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, Europe is still in search of itself from an identity standpoint. And I think there's no doubt about it that GDPR, in theory, was this great unifying rule. And here in the United States, we've seen the progression of lawmaking. In 2023 alone, there are another 7 or 8 states that have passed data privacy laws, even where I am in the state of Texas, where people thought that would not happen. The interesting thing is that legislation like this, regulatory laws, rules that come into play, usually have some sense of favor that goes in the direction of a certain industry or a certain company. Over here, it's lobbying, and the pure American form of lobbying that creates that situation. But over there, what Europe is doing is they see the velocity at which data is changing hands, and data is the fuel for artificial intelligence. And data is the fuel for this quest for singularity that these really big companies, and we can name them here in just a second, but Facebook and Meta, period, it's been their business plan to violate our privacy. Part of their whole game plan was to get to know as much about us, rightly so, for them to put very relevant and meaningful ads and feeds, streams of content. And it's been tremendously profitable for them. A couple of years ago, when Apple came out with the capability for the user now with their Apple TV, with their iPhone, with their iPad, to be able to say, I don't want to have this app track me from the web to the app. And obviously Facebook was the one that was a salvo shot.
The target, right?
They were the target. They were the target. And if they are what they are in terms of size, in terms of profitability, they're going to be a target no matter what. But to the point I made before, they've been a little sloppy in terms of how they've governed data. And they've certainly been sloppy in terms of how they adhere to the laws. And I think the European Union is going to try to make an example out of them. And then below all the data privacy talk, I guess there's the other side of it too, which is antitrust. Let's see what we can do to thwart any type of monopolistic type of behavior that could happen with companies that have that kind of power that's fueled by data.
And that was the focus of Google's penalty. And in Europe, they were slapped with a multi-billion-dollar fine for antitrust violations. So we had talked in previous episodes, Tim, about data ownership, how important it is for organizations to have their own view of a customer instead of relying on someone else to aggregate it for them. It's important to point out that what we're seeing in Europe doesn't mean that US companies can't do business there, but you absolutely have to be aware of the right way to do that. And it's still important for US companies to have a picture of their customer, to be able to provide services based on the data they're collecting. But what we're seeing is that not only does Europe want to allow consumers to be able to request that their data be deleted, but they really want that data hosted on European servers, on European soil, and not have that transferred back to the US. There's some concerns about that data being vulnerable to US government and investigations and so forth that don't have the same protections they do in Europe. So lesson for the viewer, if you're cloud hosting, every large provider has the option for you to keep data in certain regions of the world and to not spread that and automatically transfer it across borders. Certainly something for companies of all sizes, but even small to mid-sized businesses, if you're doing business overseas and you're capturing data for European customers, it's important to keep that data onshore. Obviously, they wanted to make an example of the big players first, but that shows that there's a precedent and they're serious about it.
When you really consider that, there is the question about what happens with the citizens' data when it is kept overseas, because we're susceptible. There is the volatility or the ever-changing winds of legislative activity, regulations, and of course, all the things that are there when it comes to cybersecurity. Certain nations are active as nation states, but there's also certain entities within those nations that want to do all they can to disrupt, at the very least, as much as they can in terms of business, in terms of commerce. We don't talk a whole lot about cybersecurity, you and I, but it's a real deal. This was something that India actually put into place. If you were a company anywhere in the world that had a certain amount of data on an Indian citizen, then you had to keep it on Indian soil. That resulted in an explosion of data centers built and data centers expanded in India. I think we'll see more of that, to be honest. I think governments want to have control, for better or worse. They do. We can talk about utopian and dystopian visions, probably more of the latter, that I think a lot of people have about what's going on with artificial intelligence and what's going on with the data governance world right now. But no doubt about it, I think, back to what we're discussing here, Europe really is the birthplace of data privacy. It's an argument between the Scandinavians and the Germans in terms of who really got the ball rolling with it. But at the end of the day, things are just different there, because from a geographic footprint standpoint and from a collaborative European Union standpoint, there's some cohesiveness in terms of what it is they want to do and putting guardrails up and to enforce rules, laws, to protect commerce, to create competition, and to be fair to the consumer, to be fair to everyone who's carrying an iPhone or a Samsung Galaxy or other Android device, or driving one, as the case may be.
Indeed. Always appreciate your thoughts, Tim. Any closing remarks on this topic?
I think we're going to see more and more of this. We've reached the tipping point here in the United States. There's a number of laws that are going to go into place, some in September, others in January of 2024. I think we'll see the tipping point there. It's worth noting, as we're talking about Europe, that after the election in 2024, we will see a valiant and more than likely successful effort somewhere in U.S. Congress to create a law for the entire United States. And that ought to be good news for everybody.
Terrific. Well, more to come.
Absolutely.